All right, hello everybody. I'm here with E.C. Winsper, who I recently found on YouTube. The channel link for his YouTube channel is in the description. I highly recommend it. He obviously knows his stuff, and I've been looking on YouTube for Platonists who have, done their work and gotten into the sources. E.C. Winsper is one of those people. He also makes funny videos that are very well edited. So I think all of us should migrate over to that channel and check it out. He also has a fairly active Discord with a lot of resources. So, E.C. Winsper, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you got into this, what your goals are with your YouTube channel, and then we can get into a little bit of history of Platonism.
Of course. Well, when I was younger, in my late teens, I was a materialist. I didn't really believe that there was anything more to the world than just matter, and that there was no point in really doing anything that didn't immediately benefit us in a bodily sense. And then because of that, my life was completely aimless and I just meandered around, not really caring about anything. Until one day, a friend of mine introduced me to something called the problem of universals. And I realized that there was a major flaw in materialism itself, which underpinned every single other belief I held. So I researched the problem itself and all the different answers that philosophers have come up with in the past. And I found Plato's answer to be the most satisfactory of all of them. From there, I read all of the works of Plato, and I came to understand that if someone living thousands of years ago could answer these questions in a more satisfactory way than any person living today, no matter how uh, scientifically educated or uh, philosophically inclined they may appear to be, then obviously they were doing something right back then that we're not doing anymore. And from there, I decided to devote my free time to researching the Platonic tradition and the various philosophers within it. And on my channel, I share the things that I've found with everyone I can, as I think it's one of the best things that has been given to us. And the only thing I can really do is share it with as many people as I can.
Yeah, very nice. Now, in the circles that I've traveled in on YouTube, there are many, as you would put it, stupid opinions about Platonism, what Plato represented, whether he could be classified as an innovator, a skeptic. There are all sorts of opinions, and that makes sense because of the structure of the dialogues. It's not always that easy to tell what Plato is actually getting at. So, as far as what tradition Plato is coming out of, I've talked about this a little bit through the channel. The main influences would be Orphism, Pythagoreanism, the mystery cults generally, and obviously Socrates, whatever his individual beliefs were. Would you mind kind of taking us through those influences that were structuring Plato's thinking? And, what do you think would be the most prominent influence? Does it fit into a broader kind of Mediterranean theological context? Would you consider Plato an innovator? Where does he stand with his predecessors?
I think Plato definitely is an integral part of an existing stream of Hellenic thought, and not just thought, but practice and experiential practice that existed long before him and continued on long after him. But what makes Plato unique is that he sort of brought together two separate streams into one that continued as one after him, where one of them was what you mentioned, the mystery cults, especially Orphism. But on the other side, there were these incredibly skeptical pre-Socratic philosophers whose main purpose in their thought was to deconstruct all of the assumptions that people made about very basic things about reality, which in turn informed the way people behave in their lives. People like Thales and Parmenides, and Socrates himself could be considered the point where these two come together, because he was, according to those around him, inspired by a spirit sent from the god Apollo in a sort of divine quest to look to the knowledge of the time and to understand what people really do and do not know. So it's a kind of blend of both. It's the experiential, it's the mystical almost side of the cultic practice, and on the other side it's this logical, rational attempt to understand what's going on at a more precise level. And Plato inherited that, and throughout his dialogues and throughout the commentaries on them by later Platonists, these two things being integrated into each other in a harmonious way is probably one of the primary goals.
Right. The experiential and intellectual, I suppose. So, once we get the dialogues, or perhaps we should look at the way that Plato released the dialogues. I don't know how much you've looked into what we can reconstruct about Plato's reception during his own lifetime. I mean, it seems to have been mixed. As I understand it, he would ordinarily release his dialogues on feast days, on festival days. What do we know about the opinion of Plato's contemporaries about the dialogues? I mean, how influential was he in his own lifetime?
Well, Plato, as well as inheriting the attitudes of Socrates, he also inherited the sort of inner circle that was previously attached to Socrates. So there was an existing sort of philosophical community in Athens that was already dedicated to some of these ideas, and towards which a lot of the public was very skeptical and very dismissive. Then when Socrates was alive, he was routinely mocked. There is a play by who was it again?
Aristophanes.
Aristophanes, that's his name, called The Clouds, in which Socrates is portrayed very negatively as a sort of sophist, really. And that same sort of attitude was attached to Plato and the early academy, where most outsiders thought that they didn't really have any purpose other than to just meaninglessly speculate about nothing. But there was a level of prestige attached to the academy at the same time, because a lot of the people who liked Socrates were quite wealthy, like Alcibiades, and like Plato himself. He owned land already, which later on grew and expanded into the academy as it existed later.
Right. Yeah, he was from a well-born lineage. I don't know how reliable this account is, and I forget actually where I read it, but someone claims that Plato is actually descended from the very last king of Athens, and that this last king of Athens, died in a very self-sacrificial manner, defending against fellow Dorians who, I suppose this kingly line actually originally descended from a Dorian branch. But so through the self-sacrifice, the people of Athens decided that no one was really worthy to succeed. And then, of course, on his mother's side, I believe, his great-great-uncle or something like that was Solon, the famous lawgiver. So a very well-connected family. And right, there was already this philosophical community in Athens, not just around Socrates, but just the educated class generally sought out these teachers, sophists, also actual philosophers. Pericles studied with Anaxagoras, and Anaxagoras was also influential on Socrates. So there are all sorts of currents, Ionian and kind of early Eleatic currents going on in Athens, and this is the milieu that Plato was immersed in. I believe he was initially, Plato, interested in drama, and he wrote some poems. And when he first met Socrates and had some of his basic notions questioned, he burned all of his existing poems and kind of set about this new direction with his life, which turned out to be very fruitful. So we're glad that's the path that he chose. Now, what happens after Plato's lifetime? Obviously Aristotle was a longtime student of Plato, but left the academy and founded the Lyceum, a competing philosophical school. At the same time, there were the early Cynics wandering around Athens. They were founded by another student of Socrates. So we have various philosophical sects in the aftermath of Plato's lifetime. To what extent can we judge the relative influence of Platonism in, say, the first 100 years after Plato's death?
Well, it didn't have a significant impact in terms of its visibility as compared to Peripateticism, which is Aristotle's philosophy, or Cynicism, but it did spread quite far to other places, as even during Plato's own lifetime, he went to different countries. He was in Sicily for a while, and there are examples of Platonists appearing in Italy and in other parts of the Mediterranean, but always they are in the minority of the philosophers around them.
Right, which is consistent with Platonic philosophy. The few are the good, the many are the bad. So, yeah, it was a minority school, but it had extraordinary influence within mathematics. I don't know the details of this, but under Plato's Academy, deductive mathematical methods were really systematized, following off of the Pythagorean tradition. The Platonic solids, for example, are called the Platonic solids because it seems as though they were a discovery coming out of Plato's school. And this kind of emphasis on epistemology takes a couple different branches. We get more dogmatic strains of Platonism, and then we get the kind of skepticism of the new academy. Now, so if we're a couple hundred years forward, 250 BC or so, if my timeline is accurate, we get this kind of shift in the institution of the academy. What can we say about this period? How much would you consider the skepticism of the new academy a departure from kind of traditional Platonism? And, are there other kind of more dogmatic Platonists operating in the background of all of this?
I wouldn't call it so much of a major departure as rather the de-emphasis of one of the two streams we talked about uh, at the beginning, where the experiential, practical aspect, which is connected to the mystery religions and so forth, that gets de-emphasized, that gets much less attention from the philosophers who are much more interested in uh, the logical, the discursive, the dialectical process, and in that gets to the extreme point that there are leaders of the academy who deny or imply that they deny that it's even possible to know anything at all.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Drawing those currents from Pyrrhonism and other skeptical schools of thought of that time. Okay. So around this time also, there is a possible influence of Plato's political philosophy on the kind of reformation of the Jewish nation, which one of the texts available through your Discord addresses this. What was this guy's name? A very odd last name. It was like Gmerkin or something, Russell Gmerkin. I might be mispronouncing that. But his thesis is that the kind of aristocratic, Hellenistic, Greek-educated Jews in Alexandria that conducted the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint Bible, were not actually translating an already existing complete corpus of texts, but were instead modifying their existing scriptures and narratives in the image that Plato prescribes in his laws. I think we drastically underestimate the influence that Plato has had because it's always been a kind of minority stream. But Plato's legal thought, did it influence the the Old Testament as we have it today? Some people have gone as far as to claim that Plato actually wrote the Pentateuch, which seems like a stretch. But this thesis by Gmerkin, if that's his name, was intriguing to me. I just read it recently. So what do you think about that? And then other influences of Plato's political thought. I know in the laws, Plato innovates the kind of, I don't know what the technical legal term is, but you give a kind of explanation for the purpose of the law, and then you give, this outline of how how legislation should be formulated and how it should be presented. And many of those prescriptions do seem to have spread and been adopted. What about the influence of Plato's political thought? He was politically active in his lifetime, like you mentioned. He went to Syracuse in order to try to kind of convert the tyrant of Syracuse to true philosophy, and kind of found his republic ostensibly. And he returned later in life when his friend Dion believed that the successor to that previous tyrant, Dionysius the second, I guess, may actually have been the right temperament. He might be receptive to the teachings, and then Plato ended up being sold into slavery and had to be bought out by someone who recognized him to regain his freedom. So in terms of his political activism during his lifetime, it's hard to say that Plato was a success, but he did have a big influence on legal thinking in subsequent centuries. So the question is the legal influence of Plato, the political influence of Plato broadly, and then what do you think about that hypothesis of the influence on, the Old Testament itself?
Well, there were definitely far-reaching political consequences of Plato's philosophy. Cicero, the Roman politician, was if he wasn't a Platonist, then he was at least partially one. I believe he once said that if Jupiter were to speak, he would speak the way Plato does. And there were other Romans who had other politically prominent or politically influential positions, like Plutarch, who was a Platonist who was familiar with some of the Roman leadership at the time. He wrote biographies on some of them, and so that definitely went into the general landscape of political thought within the Roman Empire. And you can see sort of parallels between the way the Roman government was set up and some elements of the Republic. Not quite as much the laws, but the idea of the sort of militarily and philosophically trained elites forming a sort of council is quite similar to how the ideal form of the Senate was supposed to work. It usually didn't work exactly like that, but that was certainly part of the
Right, yeah. So do you have an opinion on Russell Gmirkin's hypothesis, or have you read that book?
I have not read that in its entirety, so I would have to go over it again to give a full opinion on it. But I think it's definitely possible that there were a lot of Hellenized Jews who had very high opinions of Plato, like Philo of Alexandria.
Right. Yeah, and Jewish mysticism has always stuck very close to Neoplatonism. I mean, being influenced by, like, Kabbalah being influenced by Hermeticism, Hermeticism being influenced by Platonism. The Abrahamic traditions in general owe far more to Plato than most people realize. And then, by extension, the kind of history of the world as a whole owes far more to the influence of Plato than people typically realize. So the 1st century BC, Philo of Alexandria is a Platonizing Jew who interprets the Old Testament in terms of Platonic metaphysics, and that has a massive influence in Egypt, in the broader Jewish diaspora, and in Israel itself. You would assume, supposing that Jesus was a real historical person, which I believe, that perhaps even Jesus had some level of influence from Platonism. Now, as we kind of move forward in time, there is a bit of ambiguity. This period, the Middle Platonists, is hard to track. I mean, Plutarch is the most famous example of a Middle Platonist, but really from the 1st century BC through to the time of Plotinus, Platonism seems to be this kind of undercurrent or something moving in the background, still highly significant, influencing esoteric traditions, influencing political conceptions, really shaping things, but not in as conspicuous and open a way as when, the original academy was an existing institution, or when the later academy is opened by Neoplatonists like Plutarch of Athens, Syrianus, and then Proclus being there, and in the Library of Alexandria, Olympiodorus and others teaching this kind of Neoplatonic curriculum and having a big influence on the rising administrative class of the Byzantine Empire. They decided that it was not dispensable, even though they disagreed with the polytheistic theology of the Platonists. They sort of had to use what they taught in terms of a kind of path towards virtue, the logical principles that they taught. The Neoplatonists taught Aristotle as well as Plato. So there's a lot of kind of synthesis of these previous relatively distinct strains. Stoicism, the Peripatetics, Platonism have always had a fairly close association, but especially by the time of those new academies in the 5th century, they all seem basically to be blended together, maybe less so Stoicism. But so what about then stepping back a little bit, that period of Middle Platonism? What can we really say about it? Was it, are there any other Middle Platonist authors that we have surviving texts from that we might be able to glean anything about, what was the state of Platonism? Where was it taught? How was it taught in those centuries?
We actually do. We have a manual on how to teach Platonism to a student from a writer called Alcinous.
Well, that's handy. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Well, most of it is very similar to the dialogues, but systematically written out rather than in dialectic form. And so it seems that in its core, Platonism really didn't change much during that period, apart from that the brief foray into extreme skepticism that we mentioned before. And Plutarch himself also very closely resembles the older academy in terms of metaphysical speculations about fate and things like that he mentions in his Moralia.
Okay. Now, Anaf Quietus in the chat is saying that Sethian Gnosticism was based on Middle Platonic negative theology. When you look at the emanationist models of Valentinian Gnostics or various Gnostic sects, it seems fairly obvious that there was a strong Platonist influence. Do you know anything about this Sethian Gnostic branch? From what I can vaguely recollect about it, it seems to have been the most pure of the Gnostic Christian sects. I think they seem to have been more monist than more dualist sects, right?
Sethianism is almost definitely the specific belief system that Plotinus is talking about in his tractate, which is called Against the Gnostics. It is very similar to Platonism, which is why Plotinus felt the need to even talk about it in the first place. He doesn't talk about, for example, mainstream Christianity because it's completely irrelevant to Plotinus's own philosophy, but this Gnosticism that he's talking about, which exists among the Platonists that he's speaking to, is close enough to his own Platonism that it has to be addressed and the differences have to be pointed out and criticized. So Sethianism is definitely very, very strongly influenced by Platonism, probably Middle Platonism in Alexandria, the same sort of landscape that we get Hermeticism from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Alexandria would have been the largest city in the Mediterranean at that time, larger than Rome even, if I'm getting that correct. But yeah, it makes sense. A lot of spiritual ideas came out of that kind of Hellenistic Egypt. All right, well, so Sethian Gnosticism is influenced by Platonism, Judaism is influenced by Platonism, Christianity is obviously influenced by Platonism. Nietzsche famously said that Christianity is Platonism for the masses, or something to that effect. There are also Platonist influences on the kind of Persian Islamic thinkers, and as well as influence from Aristotle. I've heard you mention some of that, the kind of Platonism of some of the Arab scholars. So is there anything you can kind of tell us about that historical relevance of Plato specifically for the Muslims?
That occurs during the Arab conquests of North Africa, the Levant, and Anatolia, where existing communities of Hellenic people were conquered, which included universities and things where Platonism as well as Aristotle were being taught. One of the most important was Haran, which is now in Turkey, where there was a community of polytheists still living there at the time that the Arabs arrived, long into the Byzantine period when almost the entire population was Christian. And the people in that town were led by some kind of school which was teaching, if not Platonism, then something very closely derived from Platonism, because there exists some writings from people who lived in that town, wherein they talk about the older Greek philosophers and are sort of dismissive of everything that comes after that. And these people were called Sabians by the Muslims because in the Quran there is a list of people who are permitted to live in Islamic societies, including Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and Sabians. And whoever the original Sabians were, no one really knows. But these Platonists, or whatever they were, decided to call themselves Sabians so that they could live within the Islamic society. And they were very well educated, and so they were very well received by Islamic leaders who needed people who were good with writing and logistics and various things that you require highly educated people for. And those people then went on to teach the children of those Arabic elites, who in turn became very interested in ancient Greek philosophy.
Yeah, okay, fascinating. So, right, we have kind of three, as I see it, there are kind of three main branches geographically of descent, the influence of Platonism. In Western Europe, the influence is probably the smallest. There are some indirect influences, who was John Scotus Erigena, I think, was a pseudo-Platonist Christian theologian who developed a system that seems similar to late Neoplatonism, although we're not sure if he actually had access to any Neoplatonic texts or even Plato. Moving forward in time, Thomas Aquinas, for example, is aware of Proclus, actually reads some Proclus, and that they have the Timaeus of Plato, they have kind of selected fragments, but there is still some kind of influence in Western Europe. So maybe you could kind of indicate any more subtle trends that move through the medieval period before, with the Renaissance, we get those Platonic texts back in the West. And then in the Byzantine Empire, there was a persistent influence of Platonism. There are some Byzantine Christian scholars who seem to have been basically Christian in name only. I haven't reviewed this history recently, so maybe you could remember the names better than I could. But an esoteric brand of Platonism did seem to be operating in Byzantium. And then, as you mentioned, this kind of Islamic strain out of the Sabians is another kind of path of development. Are there any other major geographic kind of extensions of Platonic influence? I've often speculated, Platonism looks very similar to Hinduism in some ways, and a lot of that seems to have been a broad diffusion of axial age Upanishadic thinking, just West generally, and Plato picked that up indirectly. Or maybe Plato went to India himself. He did travel for 10 years. Or perhaps later on with Alexander's conquest, people in India actually received the dialogues, and later Hindu thought could have actually received some kind of influence from Plato. That's pure speculation, and I've never really seen a good argument for it. But that's one hypothetical fourth branch of Platonic influence, moving back east, influencing trends there. I mean, ostensibly, it could have had an influence on the formation of Mahayana Buddhism itself, which took place under a Greek king. So, yeah, what about those kind of major geographic extensions as we move into the medieval period? Am I missing some? What are some of those subtler strains that we might not be aware of?
Well, I definitely agree with the three-way diffusion that you spoke of. The the Indian one, I'm not entirely sure about. I think there probably was some influence of Greek philosophy because there was a Greek state in northwestern India for a while, but I think it's more of parallel developments. I think that's more likely than a direct influence of one or the other.
Fair enough.
Although I definitely think it is possible. In Western Europe, most of Plato's dialogues were not widely available and weren't translated into Latin, while Aristotle was. So throughout medieval times, when Latin is the primary language in Western Europe, Aristotle is considered the sort of spokesperson for all of ancient thought, and Plato is a very obscure figure. But there are sort of there is an underground stream of Platonism that actually comes back into Europe from the Islamic world through Andalus in what's now Spain and Portugal, where Muslim rulers in that area were reading works influenced by Plato from other Muslims, and some of those were translated into Latin and passed around clandestinely because they contained quite a lot of stuff that was considered very heretical by the Catholic Church. An example of this would be a book called The Picatrix, which is primarily a book of magic, but it contains large sections of theoretical information about how the people who compiled it thought the world works, that you have to understand before you can attempt to do the practical operations. And a lot of that comes from Plato and from Iamblichus, actually. There's a significant amount of influence from Iamblichus and his brand of theurgy in the way that the writers of that book thought magic and metaphysics in general was supposed to work.
Which is sort of interesting because I believe that Iamblichus was ethnically Arab. So it's that they had this affinity with Iamblichus.
He was an Assyrian, so he was related.
Okay, I see. I didn't mean to interrupt. You go ahead.
Yes, and so that sort of thing was circulating underground. So people who were interested in less public types of thought that risked heresy, those people would have been more familiar with Plato than mainstream thinkers and scholars and theologians were.
Right. Now, what about what can you tell us about the Byzantine Empire and the influence of Platonism there? I mean, obviously, during the Renaissance, the Medici got their texts from the Greeks. So, Michael Psellus, I think, is one example of a Byzantine scholar who was highly influenced by Platonism. Are there
Yes,
other? Uh,
Psellus was a
mhm,
Hermeticist, definitely.
hmm,
Um, the major one uh, who was the one who essentially kick-started the Renaissance, uh, and that was oh, I'm sorry, his name has just vanished from my mind.
I'm sure it'll come back in a moment. Also, the chat
Platon,
feel.
that was it.
There you go.
Theomistus Platon,
Okay.
and he was secretly a Platonist. He wrote a book in which he attempted to create a new theological system based partially on Platonism, also on various other types of ancient philosophy. And he kept it a secret because it advocated for polytheism, among other things. And it was destroyed after he died. But he actually traveled to Italy as part of the Council of Florence, which was an attempt to fix the schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. And while he was in Italy, he was giving lectures on the differences between Plato and Aristotle. And one of his students was Marsilio Ficino, who was a
Hmm.
Catholic priest who then became a Platonist and wrote a book called The Platonic Theology, in which he attempts to synthesize Catholicism with uh, Neoplatonism, specifically of Plotinus.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay. Um, so the chat, feel free to ask any questions of Edward while he's with us. Now, moving then into the Renaissance, I mean, I think everyone kind of knows the story of the Medici getting those texts and kind of the rise of Hermeticism again. I mean, these occult currents go all over the place, influencing Rosicrucianism, influencing, Hermeticism was very popular in Victorian England. There are references in Shakespeare that seem to make something of this Hermetic worldview. Um, you know, would you say that the Hermeticism of that period, the Rosicrucianism of that period, is inevitably wedded to Platonism? I mean, how distinct would you draw those spheres, Rosicrucian and Hermetic, Renaissance and early modern movements, and Platonism proper?
I would say that all of those things are outgrowths of Platonism. They are systems that are separate from each other, but all of them rest on a Platonic foundation where they make some basic assumptions that are uh, firmly rooted within the Platonic tradition and then go outwards from there by integrating, you know, uh, things from the Jewish tradition, things from the Bible, etc. In the case of Rosicrucianism.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So here we are, kind of in the early modern period. There are various occult practices that are influenced by Platonism to some degree. When does like modern scholarship of Platonism proper start getting off the ground? It seems like it's a very slow start, really, in Western Europe. I mean, there is Thomas Taylor, who I've heard you mention. I've read some of his translations and a couple of his original works, and he's definitely an interesting thinker, a real anachronism. But is there anybody before Thomas Taylor that kind of forwards Plato's scholarship? I know there were philosophers before Thomas Taylor that were clearly influenced by Plato, the most conspicuous being Leibniz, who I consider to be basically a straightforward Neoplatonist. I don't think his system is that different from that of Proclus at the end of the day. But yeah, early modern Europe, where is Plato being taught? How is he being taught? What is the state of scholarship there in the 1600s?
Um, well, in the 15 1600s, we it's in the northern parts of Europe. It's essentially the same as it was in the 1400s with the early Renaissance. Marsilio Ficino, there is an occultist writer called Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa who wrote 3 books of occult philosophy, which are essentially a collection of every single piece of information he could find about practically every subject. And there are large quantities of Plato and Pythagoras in there. And those get disseminated just as before among occult circles primarily. But later on, when you get to the 18th century, there is a sudden upsurge of Platonism in specifically England. There's a group called the Cambridge Platonists, of which the most famous is Ralph Cudworth, who created a work called The True Intellectual System of the Universe, which is advertised as a big book of why atheism is wrong. But it essentially describes Neoplatonism while inserting Christian terms, like referring to the one as God. And Thomas Taylor actually comes only a few decades after that. So he was almost definitely familiar with Platonism from the Cambridge Platonists.
Okay. And the Cambridge Platonists continue for, I mean, this is a tradition, I don't know at Cambridge specifically, but in British universities all the way up until the lifetime of Bertrand Russell, I believe. Russell was basically trained as a Platonist to some extent, and his later philosophy has similarities with Platonism. So yeah, well, what happens to that kind of Cambridge Platonist tradition?
Well, it continued right the way through until more contemporary times, when there was this the rift that now exists between what's called analytic and continental philosophy began to develop, where in England and in countries associated with England, like the United States, a sort of positivist, extremely focused on logic and grounded very strongly in material evidence, essentially the denial of anything that can't be verified by consensus experiments and so forth. While on the European continent, a very different sort of philosophical stream begins to emerge, where idealism is much more accepted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, although when I look at the kind of continental philosophers, I don't know how big the influence of Plato really was. I mean, I've read some of my Heidegger. I could read more, I suppose. Compared to Proclus, though, I think Heidegger kind of falls flat. He's always searching and, kind of grasping after concepts. I mean, famously, Being in Time, he never actually finished. So I wouldn't say that Heidegger represents a complete philosophical system, but I mean, do you see any direct Platonist influences in continental philosophy?
I wouldn't say there are direct influences, but there are definitely indirect influences.
Someone's
Hegel's
mentioning
phenomenology of spirit is
yes.
Very much influenced by ancient Greek thought in general, not any specific tradition, but concepts like dialectic are strongly associated with Platonism, whereas his ideas about the world are much closer to Stoicism.
Right. Also, Schopenhauer, rough contemporary of Hegel, was strongly influenced by Plato. He I believe in his undergraduate education, like primarily studied Plato and, of course, oh my goodness, how am I blanking on this name? Critique of Pure Reason, Immanuel Kant. Okay. Yeah, so Schopenhauer was strongly influenced by Plato as well, and I think that Schopenhauer's mature system is arbitrarily different from Platonism. It's really just a matter of the phrasing of it and the way he grounds his ideas. I would say Schopenhauer was more of a foundationalist and empiricist than Platonists. I mean, I've had different opinions about Schopenhauer. I got into Schopenhauer before I got into Plato, and now I see those connections, but I also see how Schopenhauer doesn't, because of his kind of wholesale buying of the empiricism of Hume and the critique of Kant, he can't really get to the intuition of the ideas in a straightforward way, identifying the intellect with that function. He actually mocks viciously Hegel for and Fichte for supporting that kind of intellectual intuition. But it's really just what the intellect per se is meant to do in the system of Neoplatonism. And Schopenhauer really can't avoid but create an analogous space in his own system for the revelation of ideas, although it's definitely a novelty. So there are a few questions in the chat. So another name asks, when face reveal? Should we expect that anytime soon from Edward?
I'm not sure. At this point, it's going to have to be a spectacular event. He's going to have to trigger that.
Okay, fair enough. Brian G, is there any significance to using Mjolnir as your emblem? Is there a Platonic connection there?
Not really. My logo is more representative of me than it is of Plato. It's the map in the background is England. The red and the white dragons represent the foundational myth of the British nations as they currently are, Wales and England, being represented by the red and white dragons respectively.
Okay.
It's essentially a symbol that existed before I decided to talk about Platonism on YouTube.
Gotcha. All right. So another name also mentions that Frege, Gottlieb Frege, was heavily influenced by Plato, which I think I've read, although I haven't read Frege directly. I've heard it's kind of a pain, but I would intend to get to it at some point. So have you heard of Prometheus Trust?
I have. I have several books from them, which are extremely difficult to get anywhere else.
Right, yeah, I ran across them in the same way. There's a different American distributor, but I think they're actually printed in England as far as I'm aware. I've also heard of some attempt to start a new Platonic academy in England. I'm not sure if they're associated with Prometheus Trust, but are you aware of any kind of contemporary Platonic movements, moves to start schools? What's going on in England as far as Platonism is concerned?
I believe that what you mentioned is being run by the Prometheus Trust, yes. And I have heard of that, and I have donated to it. That's really the only one that I'm aware of that's specifically linked to Platonism. Okay,
very nice, very nice. All right, well, we've gone through the history, and I think people, again, just dramatically underestimate the relevance of Platonism as a school of thought through history, even the direct influence of Plato himself on major thinkers. And, you really can't understand the history of the Western world or the history of the world more broadly in the influence of Abrahamic faiths without grasping this kind of core philosophy at some level, and is, as I said, severely misunderstood. Plato is often painted as more of a skeptic, and even his own academy subsequently tended towards skepticism, maybe interpreting some some of the ways that the doctrines are portrayed in the dialogues, in the same way that more contemporary observers have, kind of leading to this conclusion that Socrates is simply this gadfly meant to kind of deconstruct. He's like a, Greek postmodern thinker or something like that. But, as I have read through the dialogues myself, and then the commentaries, especially the commentaries of Proclus, I'm seeing a very comprehensive system, and it's one that accords with tendencies in modern physics, ideas like the Higgs field, for example, in quantum mechanics, the idea that there is this kind of unspatially differentiated field of potencies in which the kind of essence of what appears in the world as discrete units of energy manifesting through the wave function, the idea that there's a more unitive substrate to manifold phenomena is totally in line with Neoplatonism. It's really the only place where that doctrine is spelled out logically prior to the modern world. Ideas of relativity, even, I would argue, can be found in Platonism. In the Elements of Theology, Proclus takes great pains to express that, certain properties are inherently relativistic, like whether something is infinite or not, for example, is always taken with respect to whatever other level of being you're comparing it with. Evaluations of this kind, and then kind of the underlying problem of Platonism that brought you to it in the first place, the theory of forms, the problem of universals. Plato at least has an answer, and many, many mathematicians today identify, at least on this problem, as Platonists, because there just isn't another good explanation. So I'm seeing that, not only does Platonism have this massive historical influence, and you can't understand history without it, but like the way that the modern scientific worldview is tending seems to be headed back towards more of a Platonist worldview. And throughout your videos, you draw analogies with modern physics, modern findings, which I really appreciate. I try to do the same. So why don't we look at that question? Can we use Platonism in building a kind of, modern metaphysics? The 20th century was this dead zone of metaphysical thought, largely because of the influence of logical positivism, as you said. So now, recovering from the 20th century, we realize more and more that we need underlying metaphysics to have worldviews that are coherent and make sense. I have a lot of optimism that we're not wasting our time by looking at these old tomes and reading, people like Iamblichus or Porphyry or Numenius or these guys. I think it's actually highly relevant and is useful in interpreting modern science. So, how did you draw these connections? Platonism, modern physics, like how are you using these ideas kind of constructively in your own kind of up-to-date worldview?
Well, there's a very good book that I read called Our Mathematical Universe by Max Tegmark.
It is good.
And right. Yes, he's not even particularly familiar with Platonism or Pythagoreanism or anything like that, but he takes information from various scientific papers and so forth, and he puts it all together and essentially comes to the conclusion that reality in an underlying sense consists of numerical data structures, not of matter. And really the way people think of matter, the way matter is portrayed in like school textbooks and things, is really a Victorian idea that hasn't had a significant impact on real science since the 1930s with quantum research. But throughout most of history until the 19th century, most most science was in accordance with some kind of hylomorphism, usually Aristotelian, but sometimes Platonic. And there was a sort of brief period when people first discovered atoms and they related them back to the old Epicurean ideas about atoms, which are really completely different from what we now know atoms in our world are like. And it seems that popular culture has stuck with that brief period, even though most physicists are now very far removed from it. So I think that book, Our Mathematical Universe, is probably a really good place to start for anyone who's interested in looking at these things from a contemporary scientific standpoint.
Right. And another name commented again in the chat, how Platonist was Gödel. The way I interpret Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and Gödel biographically was, as far as I'm aware, a Platonist, but the theorem really demonstrates that you can't consistently demonstrate the validity of mathematical propositions within the context of a formal system. In other words, dianoia, the faculty of discursive reason, is insufficient to ground mathematical truth. And yet, Gödel proved without, even though we can't use dianoia explicitly to ground all mathematical propositions, we can somehow know them to be true. And how could that work unless there was this other faculty besides discursive reason, intellect, where we are making direct intuitive contact with another realm? So Gödel's incompleteness theorem to me looks like a very strong proof for Platonism, or at least this specific aspect of kind of Platonist psychology, the intellect dianoia distinction. So he also asks, how close was Kant to Platonism? I'm not sure. I know that Kant was a subscriber to the Leibnizian Wolffian system before being influenced by Hume. And so I assume, along with Kant and Wolff, that he bought into a lot of Platonist doctrines. But I haven't actually read through Kant's early work to know whether he was self-aware of this fact or, because Leibniz doesn't always kind of broadcast or advertise his Platonic influences. Another name asks, what is the Platonic doctrine you least agree with? That's a good question. I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. The question of the uniqueness of the universe. There are different ways of interpreting this. Leibniz also falls on the side of Plato. In the Timaeus, Plato makes very explicit, or at least if we're to trust the character Timaeus in that dialogue, that the demiurge saw fit to make one world as the most perfect reflection of the logoi in his mind. This was a conscious decision of the demiurge to make a unique universe. Leibniz justified the same sort of position in his own way, and it's something that I'm not sure how I feel about, because I think there are strong arguments for some kind of multiverse. Like the reason I bought into the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics when I was looking at those problems was that it has explanatory power. It's kind of just the common sense way of interpreting the math. That's how Hugh Everett, who came up with the many worlds interpretation, thought of it. And if you don't accept the many worlds interpretation, you run into this problem of how the wave function collapses kind of in a way faster than the speed of light, such that information ends up traveling faster than the speed of light. So it seems to violate general relativity if you don't go with the many worlds interpretation. Now, others will say that a pilot wave theory can fix this somehow, better than a traditional Copenhagen interpretation. I'm not sure about that. And there are other exotic solutions, like random collapse theories where every so often wave functions simply collapse. That's one way of accounting for it. It's a kind of stochastic process. I wouldn't say that's a real explanation. Whenever you stop at like a random number generator in your theory, you probably don't have a complete theory. But yeah, so with the many world interpretation, it seems like a more elegant fit. Also, just in terms of parsimony, to me, a multiverse is more parsimonious than a single universe, simply because if there's only the one universe, then you have to explain why the initial conditions, why the laws are such as they are in no other way. Now, of course, the Leibnizian or Platonic explanation is like providence, and okay, that's compelling. But then Leibniz also has this idea that the world is as great as it can possibly be, and not just in terms of goodness, but also in terms of magnitude. So perhaps, we can interpret this doctrine of the singularity of the universe in Platonism by saying that when we talk about multiverses, it's not really distinct worlds. We're in something like, from is it the Phaedo? The myth of like the depressions in the earth, that the earth is much larger than we think it is, and what seems to be the surface of the earth is actually the bottom of these great caves. And so we're all in various caves, and the earth is this giant thing. Maybe that's kind of what it is with the multiverse, right? So it seems like we're in this one universe that started with the Big Bang, but really this is just one depression in a much larger structure, and that's how you could account. The multiverse may just be what that one universe created by the demiurge actually is. So that's probably, I'm not sure if I actually disagree, but if there was any doctrine that I disagree with, it would be that.
I definitely think that is a valid interpretation. I've come up with that myself independently, almost exactly what you said. That if there is a multiverse, if there is a sort of manifold of universes, that together as a group is unified in that it's a group, and therefore participates in the one in that sense.
Right.
And I don't think it would be necessarily wrong to call that the universe, that entire group.
Right. So is there any other doctrine then that you might disagree with?
I think the biggest issue I have when reading Plato is to do with poetry and art and such, because he puts forward multiple arguments regarding poetry and art and various traditional things that existed in ancient Greece and which exist today in other forms. But he understates the positives and overstates the negatives, in my opinion, in such a way that if someone just reads the Republic, which a lot of people do, when they come to Plato, they think, right, the Republic is Plato's magnum opus, I'm going to read that, and then I understand Plato. And of course, in the Republic, the city that they create, poetry is banned. Anyone who attempts to recite Homer will be kicked out of the city. Of course, this isn't actually a city that's supposed to exist in reality, but a reader probably wouldn't understand that if they've only read the Republic.
Right. Well, Proclus addresses this in his commentaries on the Republic, and what was really satisfying for me in his explanation is that because the Republic is meant to be the ideal city, kind of ex hypothesi, the individuals in that society don't require the medicine that Homer and the other poets and dramatists provide. For someone who already has a manifold character, who is drawn in many different directions, Theater can offer catharsis, release from those basic pleasures and passions, participation in a larger identity, unification with the audience. You're suspended, as in the ion, from that chain emanating from the muses through the playwright to the performers down to the audience. So it's definitely a divine energy that you're receiving and can help you, but only if you are the kind of person where that is moving you closer to unity. For example, like for us to ascend to intellect is a good thing because we're already more manifold than intellect. But if we were a henad, if we were a god, and we descended to an intellectual condition, that would be a degradation. So, for the people in the Republic who are supposedly perfectly trained and disciplined and like unitive already, Homer and these other poets would be counterproductive. I think there's something to that. Maybe there does come a time when you move beyond the need for that kind of art. Maybe the sannyasi in India, in deep contemplative meditation, completely by himself. It's not going to really help him if you read him a poem. You might kind of be doing more harm than good. You're just distracting him from his meditation. So I really like that answer of Proclus to the problem, and he has a few other explanations as well.
Yes, that same principle also applies very strongly in Iamblichus towards religious practices and theurgy, where the civic rituals, the public animal sacrifices and the celebrations and things, they are the material, the lower kind of theurgy that is good for people who are in that position. The plebes, basically, who aren't educated philosophically. And then there are things like the Orphic hymns, which are for a more refined kind of person, a more philosophically inclined kind of person who doesn't necessarily need to engage in the things in those public rites in the same way as the others do. And then right at the top, there's a kind of sort of perfectly mental meditation where no physical motion or sound or anything is required, which is for the absolute elites. But even though someone can ascend, someone can advance spiritually to the point that they're at that level where they don't need those things, many of them will still do those things as an example to their inferiors, to show them this is the way you're supposed to do things.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the same reasoning. Nice. So there's a question from Cinema. What about just rejecting relativity for LET? Can you expand on what LET is? And then another name, how would you say the East Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and so on, engage in or with Platonic thought, if at all? I haven't thought about this too much. Are you aware of any influence of Platonism in East Asia? Is it taught today? Sometimes when I'm watching anime, I do notice Platonic themes. I'm sure the Japanese have been familiarized with Platonic concepts, but are you aware of an influence?
Not on Taoism, although there are quite a few very strong parallels. The Taoist equivalents in those parallels tend to be so old that there's no possible way that they're influenced by Platonism. And they're also so culturally divorced from the Western world that there's very little, if any, chance that they have influenced the Hellenic thought. It's a sort of parallel growth that just happens to converge on the same principles.
Right.
The Japanese, especially nowadays, they like to essentially take anything they can find and smash it all together into one thing. you'll see a lot of Japanese media involves Gnostic themes, where there's some entity posing as a god that is the primary villain.
Hmm. They also love their daimons, spirits feature heavily in, again, my main cultural absorption from Japan is anime, but multiple shows come to mind. The idea of like a daimonic realm, your individual kind of tutelary spirit, the idea that malevolent spirits do occasionally come into the world and try to occupy bodies, all very Platonic in nature, although obviously the idea of spirits is far more universal than Platonism. But yeah,
I think most of those ideas come from the ancient Japanese traditions, the tribal ones,
yeah,
from even before Buddhism.
that's very possible.
Because
Mm-hmm.
when I do know that when Buddhism first arrived in Japan, the Chinese Buddhist priests used to go to the Shinto shrines and then convert the deities to Buddhism, and then it would become a Buddhist shrine but with the same deity.
Yeah, going right to the top of the hierarchy. I like that. That's good. Um, okay. So yeah, all right. Well, this has been a good discussion. We've mostly stuck to the kind of historical background. Now, if you have time, we could go into, now that we're at kind of the end of the stream, we could go into Plato's actual system. I mean, if you want to outline some of those briefly, or maybe we could schedule a part 2 and kind of keep that in its own proper sphere and give it the attention it deserves. Do you have a bunch of time, or would you like to do a part 2?
I have time now, but if you would prefer to do a part 2, that's fine by me.
Okay. I think I do like the idea of treating the doctrines on their own. And yeah, I think we probably shouldn't go too far into it. Let's just give a kind of bare bones sketch of some of the basic Platonic ideas. So first of all, how would you divide up Platonic doctrines? Obviously there are some ideas in metaphysics, the idea of the hypostases. There are some ideas in ontology, the distinction between essential beings, what essence is precisely, superessential beings, and then there seem to be psychological claims, what mental faculties do we have according to Platonism, and what are their proper targets, what are the objects of these sense faculties or intellectual faculties, and then ethical claims, of course. So how would you approach that? If you had to teach someone from scratch, what are the basic tenets of Platonism, and what basic categories would you put those tenets in?
I would say that fundamentally Platonism is ontological. Everything, all these other aspects of it are directly stem from its ontology, where the Platonist begins with the absolutely most basic things that can be definitely understood to be true under all circumstances, and then Platonism is essentially an attempt to get from there to the phenomenal world that we actually experience, and what exactly is necessary to make that journey from things that are perfectly absolute and basic to the plurality and experience that we have here.
Right, and everything unfolds from that singular idea, just like the ontology does, from the one to the many, and there's only so many paths that you could take in that. A text like the Parmenides, for example, seems very impenetrable, and it's not entirely clear, partly because they're using this kind of mathematical method, right, where you look at one hypothesis and then negate it, a reductio ad absurdum, to prove its alternative. But then in the context of the Parmenides itself, it's often not clear at the end of the day, after you've gone through these different hypotheses, like, okay, so what exactly are we claiming? But there are certain themes that continually reoccur, like the idea of the same, or the same, the different. There are like 5 or 6, the greater or lesser, 5 or 6 of these kind of basic elements that have to be considered in the most fundamental level of metaphysics. And it's what is Platonism trying to do? It's trying to solve the question of like, what is the constitution of the realm of forms? Which forms are more absolute and more perfect? Like famously in the Parmenides, Parmenides asks Socrates, is there a form of hair? Is there a form of mud? Kind of incomplete, composite beings, like, do they have eternal forms? What gets to be an eternal form? And in answering that question, like, you get this basic great chain of being by necessity, where the most universal, most general are fewer in number, and they descend into greater plurality. Have you thought about this issue as it's treated in the Parmenides? Is there a single document that you could refer to kind of clue people in to the greatest extent possible to the nature of that hierarchy of forms? Like what's on top, which forms are more fundamental?
Well, I think the Elements of Theology by Proclus is definitely an introductory text in that sense, because it begins with the most basic thing you can say, which is that anything that is in some capacity one thing, and therefore relies on the prior existence of the concept of one, which I don't think anyone who's reasonably minded can really argue against that. It's a very basic principle, and everything progresses out of that in a sort of chain of logical steps. But I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that when we have this hierarchy, it's not just a hierarchy where simpler things just sort of create more complex things. The complexity of the lower levels is contained in a simpler way in the higher levels. So for example, the difference between soul and intellect is really that soul contains what are called logoi, which are the individual sort of blueprints or plans or sets of experiences and properties that objects in the material world have, and they are derived from the eidai, the forms in the intellect, which all exist together. So in the intellect, they're all unified as one, whereas in soul, they are not divided, but distinguished from each other, so that the soul contemplates each of them one at a time. Whereas in the forms, in the intellect, when you're looking at one form, it's really not possible to look at one form without looking at all of them. It's a bit like one of those fractal images where if you zoom in, it's the same image again repeated, and you can zoom in infinitely. So any part of it contains the whole thing. So it's closer to the one in that sense.
Right. So you're getting two basic principles of Platonism there. One is that each order of beings, or even each individual substance, reflects the other orders of reality according to its own nature. So, for example, like intellect contains soul intellectually. Soul is soul by being, and then material things receive soul through participation. Soul touches each level. Everything in some sense touches everything else, but this is like the relativity thing, wherever you measure from, the way in which intellect appears is in a fashion that is appropriate for the vessel that is receiving those particular intellectual energies. So that's the one, that all is in each, but appropriately, like in the appropriate proportion. And then the idea that higher beings contain things in a more unitive fashion, lower things contain things in a more manifold fashion. And I think like the kind of utility for this in ethical terms, in thinking about political structures, is really just, it's kind of one big argument for the necessity of hierarchy. You know, when you read Proclus, for example, he's obviously a sincerely religious man. You know, he's not writing this for intellectual curiosity. He's engaged in theurgy, he's engaged in these rituals. He really believes that each being can attain its proper perfection by following in the train of its presiding deity. You know, just like in the Phaedrus, we're all in the train of our presiding deity. And you know, that seems to be something that's lacking in the modern world. You know, we don't have the grounds for establishing this hierarchy. And many of the objections that people may raise, Platonism, in this idea that each contains all, and that, you know, higher things contain more unitively than lower things, it provides an account of, you know, or it provides a kind of rebuttal to the common objections to hierarchy in general that people today have. You know, the idea that, well, if somebody is on top, that means they're going to abuse their position. And that just ignores the idea that, like, we are all entangled in a one great living being, right? The one, what's the Greek word for it? That the something zoe, or do you know what I'm talking about? The one living being, kind of the prime.
I know what you mean, but I'm not sure about the Greek term.
Yeah, anyway. We are all part of this. And, you know, our hierarchical roles are built into our natures. And so, like, identifying who you are, knowing thyself, and then following in the train of those who can properly perfect you becomes, it's just obvious. You know, like, we're restarting the reading group soon for anybody who wants to get involved with the first Alcibiades. And the way that Socrates approaches Alcibiades is exactly along these lines. First, you have to dispel the kind of twofold ignorance of thinking that you know these things when you don't. Because, you know, for example, with the intellect, the forms are contained by nature according to being in souls. An imprint of the forms are there, and so everyone feels like they have them, because in some sense they do, right? Each contains all necessarily, and we recollect into conscious apprehension things that are there at a deeper level. And so people often have the kind of pretension that they know things like the nature of justice or other things they talk about in the dialogues, when in fact they don't actually know them. They just have an archetype in their psyche, and they feel that presence, and then that motivates them to have this kind of pretense to knowledge. So he dispels that and then shows that, okay, what is it that you want, Alcibiades? You want power. You want to rule over Athens. You want to become the leader of the Greeks. You want to rule all of Europe and then Asia as well. Like, you can't do this without wisdom. You can't basically do this without me, who am your kind of presiding spirit. Or, like, by analogy here, Socrates fills the role of Alcibiades' daimon. So yeah, that kind of ethical consequence is very often missed, like in discussions of theory of universals. Like, okay, why does this matter? Who cares if there's a triangle in some, like, ethereal realm somewhere? Like, what is it? It matters because it explains how hierarchies function, why they exist. One of the doctrines that you've outlined in several videos is the doctrine of the series of beings, or the serai, I think is the term in Greek. Right. So why don't you explain that, and, like, how that interacts with this idea of, like, your proper presiding spirit, and, you know, what order you belong to.
Well, the emanation that begins with the one, then goes to intellect, then soul, then matter, is a series of universals. These chains, these serai, which also begin at the one, are differentiating principles that pass through each of these and order it according to the unique nature of each henad. So it's you could think of it as a grid where the the horizontal lines are the layers of reality, beginning with the one, then the intellect, and so on. And then the vertical columns are the proper natural place of each thing within that layer of the hierarchy. So, for example, the hierarchy of the layer of matter, it's not all just of a single quality. It's not that all matter is exactly the same in worth and in properties and in its uses and so forth. Every kind of matter is individuated and has its proper function within the wider cosmos because of these vertical chains that connect it directly to the one through the henads and their specific individualities. So even within a given hierarchy, there is a more concise hierarchy existing at each level where every individual, not just groups, but specific beings, have specific places, specific functions that belong to them individually. And it is by planting yourself firmly there and engaging with that you can realize your potential in that layer of the hierarchy.
Right. Yeah. And I think you've mentioned Al-Kindi has a treatise on these rays and their nature and how they connect also to various magics. I mean, one deficit of modern scientific thinking is we've really emphasized how matter comes to be compounded with other types of matter to have different material configurations, and how you can get through efficient cause from hydrogen to more complex systems. And that's like, okay, that's all well and good in that you have to explain that at some level. But unless you have this vertical dimension, the rays coming down, it's going to be hard to make sense of the problem of universals. It's going to be hard to make sense of moral problems, like you kind of say there, like the rays and where you fall in the chain of beings tells you your proper place and your proper perfection and what you ought to do. But anyway, yeah, what about this kind of, how can we use this knowledge of these rays in the ways that Al-Kindi suggests? Like, what's like one practical way that kind of manifests in either through magics, like Al-Kindi seems to suggest, or maybe ethically, like what is the kind of consequence for practical life of this doctrine?
Well, it speaks to the specific virtues that belong to individual entities, including people. So what can be understood by understanding this is how one entity can be used to assist another in a more indirect way, through the vertical chain, as opposed to purely horizontally, purely physically. And that includes the ethical dimension and how we live our lives. It may be appropriate for one person to do something, but inappropriate for a different kind of person to do the same thing. And of course, socially, this leads to the various traditional systems that existed in the past, where you have different groups of people who have specific social functions and they have responsibilities based on that. And they aren't supposed to move from one to the other, because
Right.
they're not. It's not appropriate for them to behave in that way, and it's only going to cause damage. They're not going to be good at it. They're not going to understand how to carry out the duties that they have. So being conscious of not just what you're personally good at, but what your personal responsibilities are to the people around you, to your family, to your community, etc., is something that materialists don't seem to care about. Really, it's they only care about things relative to the personal pleasure that they can bring them. But when you consider that the only way to actually achieve your own potential in life is to fit into the role that you naturally have, you can see that there is a structure to what you're supposed to be doing, and you can act on that.
Right. And you can't understand that structure unless you can trace your specific attributes and abilities back to their source and identifying that source. I mean, there's no other solution than the theory of forms to even get there. So you mentioned, I mean, mainly this issue of kind of identifying the kind of essential properties that come with a being like you in your specific position. But then there's also ways of using this knowledge of which universals are being channeled by particular physical events in the ways that the Greek polytheists used on a regular basis, like the idea that these rays, these divine energies, actually do inform and affect the way that representations, likenesses of the gods affect us. Like if we live in the image of some particular god, then we, in some sense, channel the energy of that god and influence others through that. Or in theatrical performance, like there was in one video that you made a very striking moment, for me at least, when you talked about the kind of the performance in the context of the Eleusinian mysteries, where the energies of the gods come through the performance. Where I've been around theater people, and a lot of them are mentally unstable, but they also do have sometimes a capacity for seemingly participating in something more than human, and that kind of transcendent experience. It's something that I think a lot of people are missing in the modern world. I mean, throughout history, we've had shamans, we've had people set aside sort of to be the ones who channel these energies to the greatest extent. And to my mind, I don't think there's another system that explains this phenomenon as well as Platonism. Like, you really need the idea of the forms, the idea of the henads, particular series, the way they diffuse and kind of cross-pollinate and then fill lower orders, and the idea that there are essential attributes of each being that place them firmly within an order, and then the idea that there are also accidental attributes that you can take on that will mean that you channel one set of energies rather than another. And from a purely kind of mechanistic standpoint, this is hard to make sense of. In like technological terms, I think of it in the way that like Tesla thought of some of his inventions compared to, I don't know, Edison or someone who's busy building like more straightforward engines. Like Tesla was very conscious of the geometry, of the form of his machines, and how the geometry of these machines would interface with the literal energies that these machines were meant to channel in the appropriate way. So it's like it's a different dimension, the vertical dimension in moral calculations, in occult operations of energies, and then potentially even technologically, scientifically. It's something that we lose, and Platonism has it. I don't think any other system has it to a similar extent. So
There's definitely no other system in the West that has such a all-encompassing metaphysics. No.
no, yeah, and I've been pushing this to the best of my ability, pushing Platonism recently. And, for me, like I was always sort of influenced by Plato as long as I've been intellectually active. Like you, I was kind of materialist, just basic science believer when I was in high school. And then in college, I started getting exposed to some more traditionalist ideas, but I couldn't exactly put them in a box. And that's when I started reading Plato. And mostly I just enjoyed it. I thought these are kind of hilarious. I would laugh out loud at a lot of the dialogues, and I enjoyed it kind of just as dialectical exercises. And I would say probably some of those deeper doctrines that are implicit in the dialogues did kind of seep in even when I was, at 21, 22, reading the dialogues really for the first time. And then, I've gone through different phases intellectually, but ultimately, I wonder if, the reason that people don't embrace it as it deserves to be embraced has to do with the idea that, it's just, in a sense, a letdown, or it's a little boring. Like, okay, really, Plato was the peak. Like, we haven't gone any higher. Like, people want to read Heidegger. They want to read, Deleuze. They want to read people who have strange, foreign sounding names that, there's some exciting mystery there. And Plato, like, okay, everybody's read the Republic. It's because it's so. It's odd because it's had this massive influence. People kind of dismiss it as oh, been there, done that, when hardly anybody actually understands what's being said. Like, okay, you read the Republic in your senior year of high school. Did you really understand it? Do you really grasp what it's saying? And people kind of take it for granted that it is just this kind of tired, used up system, and nothing good is going to come out of it. It's a really unintellectual attitude. But it's, yeah. What do you? I guess the closing question before we wrap up: why isn't Platonism more widespread today? Why don't people understand the relevance of it historically in terms of offering a comprehensive metaphysics? It seems to have so much going for it, and it's fun to read. Like, the Platonic dialogues are much more enjoyable than reading Kant, by far. So what accounts for that? Is it nefarious daimons getting involved in human affairs, trying to hide things from us, or how do you account for this?
I think it is just one of the many symptoms of the progression of modernity, where almost every culture has this idea that over time things aren't just constantly improving in the way that people nowadays seem to think, but they're rather getting worse in a variety of ways. And I tend to agree with that, looking at the way things have changed from even the early modern period to now, where nowadays people are seemingly less literate when it comes to literature of any kind. Most of the people I know don't read books at all, whereas 100 years ago, everyone read books all the time, and many of those books were important classics, including the Greeks. Aristotle was considered a basic part of a normal education until relatively recently, and this attitude stems from a general lack of interest in anything that's old. The modern idea is that things just continuously improve over time. We have new inventions, we have new gadgets, we have all these other things, and therefore people who lived in the past were stupid because they couldn't create these things that we have now, and therefore their ideas aren't worth as much as currently existing ones.
Yeah, um, it's a little sad and mundane. And so, is it really just like, does it come down to people involved in the philosophy of education? Like, I want to blame somebody. If I can't blame evil spirits, then is it, like, who is that American philosopher of education? More? Something more? Anyway. Um, I think it's a mystery that deserves to be solved. Like, what accounts for this collapse in the classics, in education generally, and this kind of modern bigotry? I think I do see signs that is changing. Like, more people are romantics about the ancient past. A lot of people have kind of gotten excited again about the idea of Atlantis. I believe that you're not on the side that Atlantis was real. I am, although I don't think that Plato is like depicting it exactly as it may have existed, but that an ancient high civilization existed. That's a very popular idea today. The idea that humanity has declined in the past and kind of reset itself, is opening people's minds, maybe the possibility that some ancient wisdom still has something for us. Um, but yeah. I'd like an explanation. So I suspect that there are deeper forces involved. Platonism can be a very liberating thing. It tells you the resources to think about fundamental truth are there in your own soul. Like, you have all that it takes. You don't have to go and get trained in some specific university. I mean, yes, you should be part of a tradition, but you don't need a credential. It's like, this is an inalienable part of human nature, that you can make contact with higher realities and they can guide you and you can get help. It's like, wow, very empowering. So I can see kind of tactically, if I was a ruling class, why I might want to keep Platonism kind of esoteric. And that has been a tendency, that the Platonic currents have often been relatively esoteric, even in Plato's own lifetime, right? Not revealing the full doctrine. So maybe there are many causes. But do you think now today, like, trying to just popularize this stuff, like, are we sufficiently in the spirit of Plato doing that? Or should this actually be a little more esoteric? I mean, obviously, I love your videos. I'm trying to make videos of my own explaining some of this stuff. Are we sinning against Platonism in doing that? Or is this a good thing?
I don't think so. I think we've reached a point in time where the people who Plato would have wanted to keep these ideas away from are so far away from us in terms of the way they think that they're not even interested. They don't care. So their own attitude is sealing them away. So as opposed to needing any kind of actual silence or locking away of the books, they're locking themselves away from the books.
Yeah, that I totally agree with that. I think the way the internet works, the people who are seeking out this information are generally maybe not completely prepared for it. And yeah, I don't rule out the possibility that some of these more esoteric ideas within Platonism or like Western occultism generally could have negative influences. I think whenever you gain a deeper understanding of reality, that comes at the same time with greater obligations. Power and responsibility go hand in hand.
Yeah, this is why I only talk in theoretical terms in my videos. I haven't given any theurgic instructions of any kind.
Yeah, good call, I would say. Good call on that. Now, if people join the Discord, are you going to be offering any theurgy lessons anytime soon, or do you have anything going on?
I may do in the future. Not every channel in the Discord is available to everyone who immediately joins. They become visible to people who have demonstrated dedication and capacity. So possibly I will be in there answering questions about any topic related to the practical side of things, or even coming up with my own essays and so forth.
Yeah, well, it's a great resource. The channel is a great resource. you're very thoughtful, and this conversation has been good. But I will say, like, your videos are so punchy and so well edited. They are a real joy. And I was thinking
Thank you
about
very much.
doing, yeah, I was thinking about doing something similar, like highly edited videos, but you made them better than I could. So I just happily point people to your channel and say, if you want a fun way of being exposed to a lot of these ideas, check out. Am I gonna forget how to? Sorry, my windows are going all crazy right now. I'm sorry, Winsper. Okay, I knew that it was something like that. EC Winsper. Go check out his channel. The link is in the description. Join his Discord. Also, join the reading groups. I'm hoping that we can work together in the future to some extent. I think this is a worthwhile cause. It's a coherent philosophy. It's what the world needs right now. So yeah, go subscribe, and we'll be having maybe a part 2, in a few weeks at some point. I think there's a lot more that we could discuss. And also subscribe to my Plato channel. I don't want to inundate this YouTube channel with all that Plato content, but it will be out there for people. So thank you guys for listening. Any last words, Edward?
No, I think we've basically covered everything I wanted to talk about. So, yeah, good talk. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. Have a good rest of your day.